Welcome to Hardcore Combat History. I'm your host, Diego Rojas, and today's episode follows the aftermath of Episode 1, Prelude to Annihilation. A mandatory warning before we begin. The following episode will contain graphic and violent descriptions, images, and videos that may be disturbing to young listeners or viewers. Viewer and listener discretion is advised. And with that out of the way, I proudly present Episode 2, Highway to Hell. Grozny, 94. I've been to a number of war zones before in my life, but I had never been in one as terrifying as Chechnya. Scott Anderson, War Correspondent. November 28, 1994. Within the halls of the Kremlin, a storm of frantic activity bordered on madness. The failure of the covert operation in Grozny to overthrow Dudayev's government, that occurred only 2 days prior, had failed. Carried out by the pro-Russian Chechen forces with the support of Russian military personnel, the operation resulted in not only significant casualties, but also a devastating blow to Moscow's credibility. Russian soldiers, captured during the failed operation, were paraded on live television for the entire world to see. An act of humiliation made even worse, as the Kremlin had passionately denied this operation, only to be shown and demonstrated to be an absolute lie. With President Boris Yeltsin and the very institution of the Kremlin being mocked by Dudayev's government, there was no other choice but to scheme. And so, an emergency meeting was led by the Russian Security Council, which immediately adopted in moving forward for a military operation to be approved and conducted into Chechnya within 14 days. Further approval was given by Russia's Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin, who urged Yeltsin to restore the constitutional order in the Chechen Republic. And so, the gears of bureaucracy and the military began to slowly churn the Russian war machine. Pre-Chechen War air operations, November 28 to November 30. Around the time that the emergency was held in Moscow, elements of the 4th Air Force and the 16th Air Army had begun bombing raids and reconnaissance into Chechnya. The entire created group was composed of 515 aircraft, of which the following were 72 Su-24 long-range fighter and bombers, 85 Su-25 Frankfurts, close air support and ground attack aircraft, 49 MiG-29 fighter, 33 Su-24MR reconnaissance variant, 35 MiG-25RB reconnaissance bombers, and 14 Tu-22M3s long-range bombers. Now, the distribution of these aircraft were largely concentrated at 19 airfields, of which were roughly 136 to 434 miles from Grozny. Yet the Mozdok and Beslan airfields, located only at a distance of 60 to 68 miles, would prove vital toward air operations being done around the clock, alongside being safe from any prospect of counterattack or sabotage. As for the reasoning toward striking first, it was best noted by Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Air Force, Pyotr Denikin, as for the why. We started at the end of November last year, referring to 1994. Aerial reconnaissance reported more than 200 aircraft, both transport and combat training, were concentrated at Dudayev's airports, ready to hang up ammunition. We were talking about 100-kilogram bombs and unguided rockets. There were also helicopters, as well as the President's personal Tu-134. We established that there were plans to bomb Russian cities. The crews were assigned to groups, each knew their route, what targets to act on. And so, on December 1st, 1994, the complete large-scale air operations into Chechnya would be unleashed. The first airstrikes were carried out by Su-25 attack aircraft of the 368th Independent Assault Aviation Regiment in the early morning hours of December 1st, 1994. Their objectives? The Kalavanka and Kankala airfields, where the vast majority of Chechen combat aircraft were currently stationed at. The attacks were carried out using unguided rockets, alongside the use of 220 to 440-pound high-explosive aircraft bombs, leaving nothing but a destructive inferno in their wake. Su-24 long-range fighter bombers followed suit, with a combination of 550 to 1,100-pound bombs to cause further mayhem and destruction. Another airport, which was also deemed a high-value target and priority, was the Grozny-Severny Airport. It was this airport that would endure the destruction of all its aircraft. in the midst of the airstrikes to hit the airport. The first casualties among civilians were inflicted on the outskirts of Grozny. Several Su-25s, while attempting to hit defensive Chechen positions surrounding the airport with their bombs and unguided rockets, instead proceeded to hit homes and apartment buildings, the aftermath leaving hundreds wounded or dead in their wake amongst the ruins of what once was their homes. This would only be the beginning of such tragedies. As night fell, the air was full of illumination munitions deployed by Tu-22M long-range bombers to observe and record the destruction for their after-action reports, alongside inflicting psychological warfare. The aftermath resulted in over 177 aircraft and 4 helicopters destroyed, 89 aircraft and 89 vehicles damaged, alongside the destruction of 12 warehouses stocked with ammunition and weapons. With the destruction of the Chechen Air Force, there was nothing to impede the control of Chechen airspace, which in the coming days and weeks would result in an apocalyptic storm of steel and fire that would burn, maim, and ravage everything in its path. Yet even with the presence of the Russian Air Force making itself known, the Russian army had not yet arrived. The reorganization and modernization of the Russian army. Before the flashpoint into Chechnya, the armed forces of the Russian Federation were far from the ideal or even force-ready machine they had been during the height of the Cold War. Although the army officially numbered 2 million on paper, the war machine that had once been the pride of the Soviet Union was now only a fragment and a shell of its former self. The results and aftermath in the Soviet-Afghan War, along with the newly adopted mindset of "come as you are to war," the consequences for the conscripts who made up the vast majority of the ranks would prove both tragic and fatal. The year 1991 marked the beginning of what could be considered the modernization of the Russian army. Downsizing and reorganization produced a doctrine centered on mobile defense, constant readiness forces to influence local conflicts, rapid deployment units, and strategic reserves to be used in wartime. Although these reforms were sound in theory, the Russian military was in no condition to implement them. Cutbacks in size and resources forced the army to struggle with day-to-day survival. Entire divisions and regiments collapsed from lack of supplies, inadequate replacements, and even officers selling equipment and weapons on the black market. Mandatory conscription, which had existed since 1989 and required 2 years of service, also began to fail. Between 1989 and 1992, many prospective conscripts simply refused to report. For those young men who entered the Russian armed forces, the culture they found themselves in could only be described as degrading. Known as the Dovoshina, the reign of the old-timers, it was the informal practice of hazing by the junior ranks, of which ranged from doing the chores of the senior ranks to violent beatings, psychological abuse, bullying, torture, and even sexual torture. As noted in one report by Amnesty International, beatings were usually done by hand or with objects such as belts and chains, and as one victim described the physical form of persuasion known as position alpha, in which the victim must bend forward and receive a forceful kick with the point of the boot in the tailbone. As the victim noted, "This is so painful that afterwards you will do everything anyone demands." Another consequence of this abuse, as noted by the Ministry of Defense in 1995, reported that 130 of its service members had committed suicide, roughly making up 1/3 of personnel that had died under non-combat circumstances. Another thorn in the Russian military, going as far back as 1989, was the Union of the Committees of Soldiers' Mothers of Russia, which greatly opposed both conscription alongside Devoshina, and used the media alongside protests to at least have their voices heard. The result of this would prove devastating, as from 1993 to 1994, 50 to 70,000 conscripts simply refused to report, and those who did simply deserted. Overall, by the time the year 1992 arrived, less than 25% of scheduled regimental, battalion, and company-level exercises were being conducted, and most battalions operated at only 55 to 60% strength. The Russian Air Force was in even worse condition. Chronic underfunding, limited training, and outdated technology left it poorly prepared for combat, especially in urban environments. One Russian pilot noted that flight training had been reduced to simply 30 hours per year, compared to the previous standard of 100 hours. Readiness at the operational and staff levels was also dismal. The sharp post-Cold War decline had made it clear that many of the Army's best officers had either left the service or seen their skills decreasing through the lack of use. With inadequate support alongside bad leadership, low morale simply became the norm. As such, many substandard conscripts who filled the ranks were brought into bases that had difficulty feeding, housing, and even paying them, and much less conducting effective individual training. Attempts in 1993 with the introduction of a professionalism system called contract personnel also failed. Training was also abysmal, as it only lasted 2 to 3 months, and in combination with the manpower shortages, if anything caused training for key positions such as snipers, grenade launcher operators, and heavy caliber machine gunners to be curtailed in the training base. Pole shortages, which was lack of ammunition, parts, oil, and lubricants, also made driver training for tankers and APCs, armored personnel carriers, ineffective. Most armored vehicle crewmen had not driven their vehicles over rough terrain or even fired their primary weapon systems. Some would also have rudimentary experience firing their individual and crew-served weapons. This lack of preparedness at individual and small unit levels would prove to be both disastrous and fatal later on down the line when the war began in Chechnya. And finally, there was the fatal lack of training toward urban combat, as noted by one Russian officer. The effectiveness of employing combat teams largely is predetermined by the high level of morale and combat qualities of every serviceman, especially junior commanders, and by their ability to act in a non-standard way that is unexpected for the enemy. In other words, the junior officers had little experience with urban operations, merely being discussed only in passing during training. Only 5 to 6 hours were allocated to urban warfare training at the platoon and company level officer training courses. Combined with limited practical experience, command and control opportunities during training were extremely limited. As such, this leadership failure would be the death of many Russian soldiers. Junior leadership, inadequacy aside, even more significant is the most complete absence of the individual and small unit urban combat training. As one Russian officer commented, tactics and methods of conducting combat operations in the city found no place in combat training programs. The same officer elaborated that there was no urban combat instruction allocated for training cadets and subunit non-commissioned officers. The Russians were unprepared for room clearing operations and other associated urban TTPs. A Russian officer writing about the degradation of his army's urban combat skills asked, "Is it the first time we are assaulting major cities, fortresses, and fortifications in general? Who is keeping our commanders from training, or at least studying the appropriate literature?" Combined arms training was almost non-existent, as dismounted infantry, APCs, and tanks had not worked together before. As one general staff officer found, skills in conducting combat operations were weak, either individually or as part of the combat order. Coupled with all other training deficiencies, the inadequate preparation for a combined arms urban fight produced catastrophic results as the Russian soldiers and leaders fought for their lives in their journey toward Grozny alongside the very city itself later on. In the late fall of 1994, with military action looming, operational level staff began to bring forces together. Confronted with a large number of understrength units, they raised composite units from all military districts in the fleet. Crew and subunit members were taken from whatever forces were available and assigned to fill vacancies within deploying units. Most learned their new duties on the job, for example, a cook being assigned as an infantryman. To further complicate staff planning and coordination, units from the Ministry of Defense, Internal Affairs, and Internal Security were assigned toward the operation. These diverse forces had never trained together, which resulted in friction, mistrust, complicated command and control procedures, and hindered the focused unity of effort. Reports vary about the actual size of the ad hoc forces deployed into Chechnya, but estimates range from 36,000 to 42,000 personnel. And the final nail to the coffin was General Pavel Grachev, who either refused to believe the military's true readiness conditions or deliberately failed to report an accurate assessment to his fellow political leaders. A staunch supporter of President Yeltsin, General Grachev may have been a true yes-man. In May 1994, he publicly proclaimed that the military was ready for combat and was completing reorganization from Cold War-era unit structures. Throughout the fall, General Grachev publicly touted the military's preparedness. However, the majority of senior military leadership and staff understood that the armed forces had problems in all areas, especially operational, tactical, and individual training. In November, General Gorbachev openly assured President Yeltsin that the Russian armed forces were combat-ready and capable of carrying out any assigned missions. Later, he stated that he could take Grozny with a single airborne regiment, a comment that would come back to haunt him later on during the First Battle of Grozny. Yet only days before fighting began, he drafted a memorandum noting combat readiness of Russian forces as poor and operational planning capabilities inadequate. General Gorachev's leadership and integrity failures to honestly represent an honest assessment of Russian preparedness was a literal betrayal toward his nation and toward the members of the armed forces sent to do the fighting. And so, on December 11, 1994, Army Group North, West, and East. On the morning of December 11, 1994, the Russian Federation created and sent 3 army groups into Chechnya from 3 directions, which were the following. Group 1, led by General Vladimir Chendyin, Army Group North. The 131st Separate Mortar Rifle Brigade, the 19th Mortar Rifle Division, the 481st Rocket Anti-Aircraft Regiment, the 170th Engineering Sapper Brigade, a battalion of the 173rd Engineer Brigade, the 22nd and 67th Separate Special Forces Brigade, a regiment of 106th Airborne Division, a battalion of 56 Airborne, and elements of the 59th, 81st, and 141st Operational Regiment of Ministry of Interior, OMON, in other words, Paramilitary Military Police, the 6th OMON Special Forces, 80 helicopters, of which were 39 being Mi-24 attack helicopters, with the rest being transport from Mozdok. In total, 6,567 personnel, 41 tanks, 99 BTRs, 132 BMPs, and 54 artillery pieces. Army Group West and East. Group 2, General Alexander Chenderov, Army Group West. The 693rd and 19th Mortar Rifle Regiment. The 481st and 933rd Rocket Anti-Aircraft Regiment. The 76th Airborne Division, composed of battalions of the 237th and 104th Regiments. A battalion of the 21st Separate Airborne Brigade. The 46th and 47th Operational Regiment of Ministry of Interior, OMON. 7th Detachment of OMON Special Forces, and 14 helicopters, 8 Mi-24 attack helicopters, and the rest transport from Beslan. In total, 3,915 personnel, 34 tanks, 67 BTRs, 98 BMPs, and 62 artillery pieces. And finally, Group 3, General Lev Rokin, Army Group East, the 255th Mortar Rifle Regiment, the 57th Rocket Anti-Aircraft Brigade, the 68th Separate Reconnaissance Battalion, a battalion of the 173rd Engineers, a battalion of the 1st Engineering Sapper Brigade, the 57th, 63rd, and 49th Operational Regiment of Ministry of Interior, OMON, and 18 helicopters, 8 Mi-24 attack helicopters, with the rest transports from Khizar. Overall total, 4,053 personnel, 7 tanks, 162 BTRs, and 28 artillery pieces. And so, at 0 hour 0500 to 0800, which is 5 a.m. to 8 a.m., all 3 battle groups began their journey into Chechnya. Army Group North, led by General Vladimir Chendyin, deployed from Mozdok and moved northwest without encountering any form of hostility. Meanwhile, Army Group West and East also began their journey, only for elevation and icy conditions to bog down their vehicles, alongside disorienting both troop and commanders alike, in moving toward the wrong direction. Army Group West, however, which was led by General Alexander Chenderov, and had deployed from Valderez, was one of the lucky few that managed to break through, as his convoy moved without incident until 11 a.m., when he reached the village of Verganakny Akaluchi, north from the first objective being the city of Nazran. The convoy would suddenly find itself blocked by a crowd of locals with women, elders, and children at the front, followed by men armed with hooks and spears in the back, who then proceeded to damage the vehicles. The Russians, banned from using force against the local civilian population, attempted to negotiate and even fired shots into the air, to no avail. The result was 7 vehicles damaged, and 4 of them being set on fire, completely destroying them. And so with haste, the convoy moved immediately away from the village in order to set up camp. In the same direction, units of the 693rd Mortar Rifle Regiment, alongside the 46th OMON, ran into fierce opposition by the locals in the city of Nazran on December 11. A crowd of over 2,000 men, alongside armed local militia, attacked the leading units and destroyed 16 vehicles with no Russian casualties or even a shot fired in anger. As the morning dragged on, the cost of vehicles began to mount. In the village of Arsuki, 3 BTRs and 4 vehicles were damaged, and in the village of Yardeneka, 15 vehicles were burned, including a T-72B1 tank. By the time the rest of the convoy arrived around 17:45 or 5:45 p.m. in the afternoon, they were traveling on the road that cut through the village of Gazi Yurt. As the convoy moved without worry, Chechen militia, who had been hiding and lying in the forest tree line for several hours for the perfect opportunity, unloaded a barrage of AK, RPK, and PKM fire into the convoy. The rounds struck armor and human flesh, of which the result was the first Russian casualty of the war. His name was Vitaly Malosnikov, a private of the 693rd Motor Rifle Regiment. He was only 19 years old. In the middle of the chaos caused by the firefight, the Russians, having panicked at seeing their vehicles disabled, alongside witnessing their first casualty, will leave behind 70 vehicles as they retreated hastily. Around the same time, a medical support unit was attacked by locals, resulting in 3 wounded, of which one would later die from his injuries. Colonel Eduard Vicentins, who had witnessed the absurdity of the situation as his soldiers were not allowed to do anything, alongside the officers who were completely unprepared, stated, "The things I've seen were unthinkable. Without any combat actions, 40 vehicles were burnt down, about a third of the whole convoy. 2 teenagers of 13 to 14 years old with spears instantly pinched all the wheels of my Jeep. On that day, over 68 vehicles were lost, and the group had to pull back." However, even with these setbacks, there was also success. On the same day that the Russians lost their first man and had their vehicles disabled or destroyed, the reconnaissance company of the 57th, led by Major Afanin, managed to prevent a group of 50 Chechen civilians from stealing boxes of ammunition off a truck of a supply convoy that was stopped along the route toward Baba Yurt. By making his BMPs maneuver all over the place, the supply vehicles were released while the civilians scared off with no casualties. However, on their approach to the village of Kazayurt, the convoy was immediately surrounded by a large number of locals alongside dozens of fully armed men. The soldiers were threatened with death unless they surrendered, and as a result, several vehicles managed to turn back with the exception of 4 BTRs and 1 truck being blocked alongside their crews taken hostage. Even as this chaos unfolded, the soldiers dared not to open fire and mostly remained inside their vehicles. In total, 46 men of the 2nd Battalion, including its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sergoroyan and Major Afanin, were taken prisoner and locked in a school basement in the village of Kazabyort. One of the BTRs, composed of 11 crew that had escaped from captivity and attempted to return to friendly forces, only to become lost after driving for 8 hours in unfamiliar territory. They were later captured in an unknown village. Throughout the day, multiple attempts by the 57th Reconnaissance Company for the release of their men being held hostage were largely fruitless, and even Major Oleg Didikayev, after personally going twice for talks with local authorities of the village of Kazabyort, was taken as a prisoner and hostage after his 3rd visit. In total, on the mere first day of operations on December 11th, close to 100 vehicles were lost, 1 soldier killed, 58 taken hostage, and over a dozen wounded. It was clear that this was only the beginning of the mayhem and hell awaiting Russian forces as they moved deeper towards Grozny. On December 12, 1994, the newly appointed commander, General Mutsuyokin, called in an arrogant manner as to why the convoy was stuck in Nazan. There was no response. The first battles, December 12, 1994 to December 31st, 1994. 15 miles to the northwest from Grozny, the village of Dolensky was sitting on one of the major routes toward the Chechen capital of Grozny, alongside having a vital oil storage facility. On December 11, Vaka Arsenov, a former Chechen police captain, was the leader of the Chechen local defense unit of the area. Having received intel from one of his men on the incoming Russian units, he immediately contacted Aslan Maskadov to provide him with BM-21 Grad launchers. Throughout the night, Arsenov's men prepared fighting positions from the hills of Dolensky overlooking the road. On the afternoon of December 12, an advance column of the 106th Airborne Division, consisting of the 137th, 51st Regiment, and 56th Airborne Assault Brigade, reached the vicinity of Dolensky. They were accompanied by 2 Mi-24 helicopters composed of both aircrews and reconnaissance officers of the 45th Airborne Special Forces Regiment. It was at a distance of 4 miles when the presence of several Chechen vehicles were discovered, and after several more passes, it was confirmed that alongside the hills and roads were 2 BM-21 launchers, 2 tanks, and 2 BTRs. Although this report was forwarded to the commander of the convoy, visual contact could not be made due to the hilly terrain. Colonel Pavel Popovisk, Chief Intelligence Officer of the Airborne Corps, requested permission from Aviation Commander General Ivanakanov to begin an attack run on the Chechen vehicles, only to be denied due to the fear of the damage that could be caused toward the oil facility and its pipes. After 20 minutes of simply flying around, the gunships left the area to return to base to refuel. Before they left, it was noted by the aircrew, we suddenly saw through the binoculars something similar to a multiple launch rocket system. The Chechens were loading a Grad. At around 2 p.m. in the afternoon, the Chechen Grads fired their first salvo at the elements of the 51st Guards Airborne Regiment alongside the vehicles of the anti-aircraft batteries of the 56th Regiment as they were moving over flat open terrain. As noted by one senior gunner of the anti-aircraft regiment, the column usually moved, overcoming the highlands on a wet clay road. Suddenly, we heard very loud explosions. It was nearby. As the gunner tried to get his bearings, to his horror, both him and the crew noticed fast-flying lights on the horizon. It was the next salvo, about 4 rockets. They fell behind the hill, and that's where the road we were driving on led. Everyone rushed to the heights. Although the column was stretched out, the 122mm rockets nonetheless hit their mark, resulting in the destruction of 3 BMDs, 2 Ural trucks, and the Gaz-66 truck with a Zu-23 anti-aircraft piece. 1 BMD was partially in pieces, while the second with a knocked-out track attempted to move, while the third was simply on fire. The Urals showed no sign of life, while the Gaz-66 truck attempted to get out of the crater, resulting from the nearby direct hit of which it fell into. As this scenery of infernal rage, the dumbfounded Russians were brought to reality by the shouts of platoon leader, Senior Lieutenant Kovzar, crying out, "To fight!" The remaining vehicles began to deploy, with some making their way towards the heights, and others remaining to assist the wounded and the dead. In a Russian UAZ, a car similar to an enclosed jeep, Lieutenant Colonel Vartseva, looking through his binoculars, discovered a Chechen spotter observing from an oil pipe. He then proceeded to order a Ural armed with a 330 122mm howitzer to turn its gun and prepare to fire. The signalman who was next to him through his radio contacted HQ for permission to fire. With his request denied twice, Vartseva, incensed, proceeded to jump out of the cabin, throwing the receiver at the signalman, and approached the gun. The signalman shouted after him, "Comrade Colonel, orders not to open fire on the oil depot." His response was merely, "Shut up. I didn't hear that order. Break your barrel organ." Turning to the howitzer, he shouted, "Load." 2 shots alongside 2 hits resulted in the pipe collapsing into a heap of shattered metal. Meanwhile, on the other side of the hill, the battalion of the 137th Regiment under its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Golubtyatakov, instantly ordered its units to spread out and obtain positions under the cover of both the woods and the hills. Another salvo of Chechen rockets immediately resulted in a direct hit of the vehicles of the 7th Airborne Company. As this unfolded, Major Kolonikov of the 82nd Artillery Battalion immediately deployed his 2 S-9 Nona batteries, which were 120mm self-prepared mortars. Around the same time, Lieutenant Colonel Golubnikov, in a BMD-1 SK-Edge command vehicle and a BTRD with paratroopers, began to direct fire. After 30 minutes, a pair of Mi-24 gunships arrived, but could not spot anything, nor having the permission to fire inside the village or to hit the oil storage, instead circled above, releasing several salvos of SA rockets, with no results. The remaining convoy of the 51st Regiment, now led by a T-72A tank equipped with a KM-27 mine roller, approached the positions at the 56th Brigade anti-aircraft battery. With the lack of coordination alongside the chaos infused with the fog of war, the men of the 56th Brigade were more than ready to open fire on any incoming Chechen forces. Moments before it was too late, one of the 56th Brigade gunners shouted, "Friendlies!" realizing that Chechen tanks could not be equipped with mine rollers. In this instant, lives were saved, yet the mayhem continued. Meanwhile, 40 miles to the east, 8th Army Corps, under General Rocklin, reached the village of Chechnya in the afternoon. They were immediately met by locals who requested them not to enter, yet they moved forward, reaching the bridge that went over the Terek River. As night fell on December 12, the Chechens shelled the 106th with tanks and artillery throughout the night. Around the time the Chechens were shelling the 106th, Rocklin, knowing time was essential, ordered his 65th ORB, or Separate Reconnaissance Battalion, to move forward and secure the bridgehead on the north side, while his 63rd PON would bypass Chechnya and block it from the south in order to avoid any surprises by any incoming Chechens. The same night, Chechen militants, alongside some armor support, crossed the river over the bridge to attack 8th Army Corps, only to run smack into the 603rd. A firefight broke out, and despite having coordination glitches and internal troops having never trained to operate artillery, they somehow managed to direct artillery fire upon the Chechens quite effectively. Throughout the skirmish, combat engineers managed to breach a safe pass for the armor through railway tracks that headed towards the Terek River. Around this time, members of the 68th Battalion crossed the river and secured the bridgehead on the southern bank. It was here that the 1st Bridge-laying Battalion of the 173rd Pontoon Bridge Brigade were faced with the difficult task of the Terek River. With a complex and changeable riverbed, the presence of islands and deep gullies being washed with a high-speed current, a non-standard approach was required in order to extend it roughly 100 meters or 109 yards. With all these existing conditions, it was impossible to equip a bridge under such conditions, yet it was necessary as the 20th Motor Rifle Division was on its way, and it would make it possible to reach the northern outskirts of Grozny in the shortest distance possible to ensure minimal losses. With no means of mechanization, boats, etc., the pontoon builders got to work in the icy waters of the Terek, and under heavy rain throughout the night of the 12th and the following day of December the 13th, they were constantly under fire from the opposite of the bank. Around the same day and night of the 13th, the 56th and other units in the village of Dolinsky had continued to endure Chechen artillery fire, yet no casualties were inflicted. However, the stress and fear resulted in the Russians maintaining a defensive approach rather than an offensive one. Back in Chechnya, the 20th Motor Rifle Division began to arrive on the night of the 13th, supporting the engineers with small arms and artillery support. By December 14th, at 1 p.m. in the afternoon, the bridge was ready, and by 2 p.m., the first elements of the 20th Motor Rifle Division began to cross the Terek River, with their appearance on the right bank taking the Chechen units by complete surprise. By the time the sun began to set, over 480 vehicles of the 8th Army Corps had crossed the bridge. Around the same time to the east, elements of the Joint Regiment of the 76th Guards Division, 165th Reconnaissance Company, and a battalion of the 237th Guards Airborne Regiment ran into prepared Chechen positions located at a cattle farm in the Arkhangelsk settlement, which was 34 miles from Grozny. The Chechens attempted to cut off the reconnaissance company with a flanking maneuver, only to run into a defensive line organized by Lieutenant Shavalev, who ordered his men to open fire without authorization, while the 237th Guards Airborne Regiment provided further fire support with dual-barrel Zu-23mm anti-aircraft cannons and two S-9 Nona self-prepared 120mm mortars. Eventually, support via airstrikes resulted in the destruction of several buildings. Both sides suffered losses, while several civilians were also killed in the crossfire. Eventually, the troops managed to pass through and set defensive positions in an open field between Asanovska and Novy Sharoy. Before the skirmish of the Askanova unfolded, Russian aviation would suffer its first loss on the morning of December 14th. An Mi-8T transport helicopter, call sign Red 27, of the 325th Separate Helicopter Regiment, piloted by a crew of 3 men who were the following: Lieutenant Colonel Lesikov, Captain Oleg Shapligin, the navigator and co-pilot, and Senior Lieutenant Sergei Deryatikov, a technical specialist. Their mission was to support via reconnaissance ahead of the units of the 76th, 165th, and 237th prior to their eventual engagement against the Chechens in the cattle farm. Their cover was provided by two other Mi-8Ts, one flown by Captain Nikolai Makov and another by Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Lotnikov, of which each helicopter was loaded with roughly about 1.5 tons of provisions. Lieutenant Colonel Lesikov, familiar with the general area, mentioned to his navigator, Captain Oleg, of a possible suitable landing zone, with the only setback of visibility being extremely low, as the cloud edge was roughly 200 feet from the ground. As Lesikov had Aznavokia, he was requested to check his bearings, but he responded that he knew what he was doing. As they neared Shamiyort, which was 9 miles from the landing zone, visibility became worse as the cloud edge almost touched the trees, and Lesikov realized his mistake, making the flight group turn right, flying alongside the Mi-29 Federal Highway, also known as the E-50 Highway, which was littered with Chechen outposts hitting among the fog. As a pair of Mi-8s flown by Captain Nikolai Makalov and Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Lotnikov flew near the junction of Shamaski-Novoy Sharoy, grenade launchers, small arms, and rocket-propelled grenades opened up from the woods. The first rocket-propelled grenade hit the leading aircraft, while the second narrowly missed being hit itself. The third helicopter, flown by Lieutenant Colonel Lesikov, having trailed further behind from the leading pairs of Mi-8s, suffered a severe hit to its rotor and tail, resulting in the performance of an emergency landing on the highway. On the radio, Captain Malkov reporting his Mi-8 had sustained multiple hits and was damaged. Lieutenant Colonel Lotnikov, whose helicopter was the second and having sustained no damage, ordered Malkov to return to base while at the same time forwarding a report to General Ivanikov, who was aboard an NAN-26 in Mozdok, to receive further support for a search and rescue party for the downed Mi-8. Malakov would later on describe just how intense the ground fire was. The alternating current switch box was smashed by a direct hit by a projectile. All the wires were torn out and hanging in the cargo compartment alongside multiple holes, one of which a child could crawl through. The external tanks were also pierced by an innumerable number of rounds, so that not a single rocket from the UB-16 FFAR pods could be shot. In the tail boom, multiple hits of small bullets and shells of anti-aircraft guns. One of the shells exploded inside the beam in the area of the stabilizer. The fragments came out in a circle, breaking out one of the control cables of the main rotor. On one of the engines, the gearbox was smashed by a direct hit by a projectile. Upon arrival, not a single gauge worked on the helicopter, and much worse. Lieutenant Colonel Lotnikov then proceeded to perform 2 gun runs along the road, hoping to keep the Chechens from approaching the downed helo, firing with salvos of SA rockets and the PKM machine gun turret located on one of its sides, all while taking hits from precise fire from multiple directions, which were a combination of twin dual-barreled Zu 23mm anti-aircraft cannons and 12.7mm Dishka heavy machine guns. Meanwhile, from a different direction, an Mi-8T search and rescue helicopter, accompanied by Mi-24 gunships, sustained heavy small arms fire, resulting in one of the paratroopers in the Mi-8T of the 21st Brigade being killed instantly. With the air being heavy with lead, the rescue helicopter alongside the Mi-24 gunships had no choice but to leave the area, lest they wanted to be shot down as well. Lieutenant Colonel Lotnikov, feeling distraught, attempted for 30 minutes to rescue the downed crew, while the whole time sustaining small arms and heavy weaponry fire, of which only until his fuel began to leak due to the extensive damage did he live against his will. Meanwhile, on the ground, the helicopter was surrounded, of which a gunfight broke out, with the pilots firing their Chechen APS pistols and the Chechens opening up with a salvo of AKs, killing both Nikolai Leskov and Oleg Shaplagin. Senior Lieutenant Sergei Dyapnikov, wounded severely in his legs, was taken prisoner, with the severity of his injuries resulting in an amputation in one of his legs at a hospital in Achakoyamartin. He would die 2 days later, after an attempted transfer to Grozny. With the 3 deaths of these men, they would only be the first of several aviators killed in the months to come in Chechnya. Back in Dolinsky, December 18th arrived, and the Chechens continued to hold on to the village, even as more Russian reinforcements, armor, and supplies arrived, only leaving until it was no longer tangible. It was only the day before that the Russian forces finally received the long-awaited order by High Command. From 0000 on December 18, 1994, all actions to disarm the illegal armed formations should be carried out in the form of combat operations, with the integrated use of all means of destruction on objects, targets, and firepower, including those located in populated areas. With these orders finally given, The Russian army would no longer have to hold back when it came to waging war. With the blessing to unleash destructive violence, they continued to push forward deeper into the heartland of Chechnya. December 20, 1994. General Rokhlin and his Kizlar group took positions near Tutso Yort, with the overall objective of moving further towards Grozny over the Suza River near the village of Petrotovska. It was around this time, as they were nearing the bridge, that reports from his scouts came that the Chechens were making preparations to conduct a demolition on the 60-ton bridge. At 1 in the morning, Rokhlin ordered the 68th Army Corps to secure the bridge and probe the Chechen defenses. And around 8 to 9 in the morning, the Russians moved with their BTRs, splitting into two bodies. The main group, of about 80 men, moved towards the village while another small group of scouts, under the command of Senior Warrant Officer Viktor Pornavarov, managed to reach the bridge undetected and disarmed the explosives. As the main group approached the village, a salvo of bullets was unloaded, forcing the Russians to hit the dirt, and as one Russian soldier put it, that's where it all began. Half an hour into the battle, the ammunition was running out. The fighters were confused. The dense fire of the militants drove them to cover. They began to gather around the armored personnel carriers, hoping to hide behind the steel vehicles. The chief of intelligence of the 20th Guards Division, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Zelenko, who was leading the battle, was wounded. General Rocklin's UAZ raced toward the village. The soldiers and officers who had taken cover behind the armor of the armored personnel carriers saw the vehicle slow down, and then the Corps commander striding toward them at full height. Having dispersed the men and designated targets, the Corps commander continued to stand at full height, demonstrating complete disregard for death. General Rokhlin was later asked why he walked from position to position, guiding his men where to shoot, alongside standing in the midst of a heavy firefight with complete disregard for his life. He was quoted as saying, "It is not the best option when a general has to personally raise the fighters to attack. But for my soldiers and officers, this was their first battle, and frankly, not the most difficult of those that lay ahead. If I had not acted as I did then, it would have been difficult for me to command later. Though I could have acted differently, for example, throwing all my available forces to help or opening a hurricane of artillery fire. But in the current situation, among other things, it was necessary to teach people to overcome fear. Therefore, I acted quite consciously, and standing up to my full height under fire, I was guided only by sober calculation. There was neither bravado nor despair." Senior Warrant Officer Viktor Ponomaryov, having witnessed this display of leadership, rushed toward the general, covering him with his body as he dragged the Corps commander to cover. As the 68th Army Corps recovered, they dug in and counterattacked as mentioned by one veteran. The scouts were supported by fire from tanks and armored personnel carriers. A little later, several howitzers also came out for direct fire. The outskirts of the village were covered with thick clouds of smoke. The scouts managed to gain a foothold near the bridge and on the outskirts of the settlement of Petropavlovska. Further support was provided by the 81st Pawn, Operational Regiment of the MVD military police, who arrived later in the morning, approaching the outskirts of Petrovska, when its commander, Senior Lieutenant Yuri Strukov, was mortally wounded by a Chechen sniper. An immediate evacuation was called, and an Mi-8 MTV-2 helicopter of the 5th Separate Mixed Air Force Squadron showed up, flying at a speed of 93 miles per hour while only 80 feet from the ground when he began taking hits from small arms fire. A direct hit by an RPG set it on fire, causing it to crash directly into the ground, killing the crew of Major Alexander Gasson and 2 officers of the medical team. It was only 2:20 in the afternoon as this scene unfolded, yet the fighting continued heavily. Meanwhile, more reinforcements arrived, which were the 104th Airborne Division, and as noted by Senior Lieutenant Albert Aleskavich Sherkarov, we approached Petrovska. There was a glow on the horizon. Everything was burning. I reported to headquarters. There was a battle ahead. We stopped in front of the village. As it turned out later, there were infantry there before us. Not a single person was visible around, only houses and unattended cattle running around. Then with difficulty, we crossed a Plasakine field, as we jokingly called it because the precipitation turned the clay into impassable mush. We dug trenches all night. I had to dig myself. And at this time, snipers were shooting in our position incessantly. As evening approached, the 81st Pawn moved into the heart of Petrovska, only to get lost and stumble directly into an ambush out in the open near an administration building known as the House of Culture. What followed was absolute mayhem. The first to burst into flames was the ZU, deprived of cover. The soldiers, stunned by the explosion, tumbled out the back, shot back, ran to the small park to the saving trees. Few made it in time. The bandits mercilessly mowed down the shell-shocked guys with burst. As this carnage unfolded, the soldiers noticed that Lieutenant Ilya Khabarov, having got his bearings in the situation, moved his armored personnel carrier to the mangled self-propelled gun to cover it with armor, while shielding the dead and the wounded. However, a Chechen RPG gunner had other plans, and as noted by one of the Russian survivors, too late, the cumulative pin pierced the side like a red-hot drill, filling the insides of the vehicle with raging fire and smoke. Meanwhile, the box, which had maneuvered into the dead end earlier than the others, snapping back with all its barrels, began to break through to get out from under the grenade launcher fire. Perhaps the officer sitting there did not see the destruction on the patch of land in front of the House of Culture, hoping that the column leader would follow him and lead the remaining vehicles out. How much can you see behind you with the hatches battened down? And there was nothing to save people with. The combined unit lost all of its wheels in a matter of minutes. The commander's APC froze at the crumpled fence of the schoolyard. A fiery, armor-piercing clot had dug into the underbelly between the hubs, breaking the mechanical joints of the chassis. The soldiers, with the major wounded in the head, lay down around the smoking wounded animal, poured bursts of fire into the enemy's firing points, crawled away, dragged away their bloodied comrades behind them to the surviving armored personnel carrier of Senior Lieutenant Sergei Utkin. As noticed by one of the crew members of the operational BTR, the first one, smearing blood on his face, squeezed through the armor of the battalion chief of staff and in shock commanded the driver forward. The box quickly sped off to the regiment. Meanwhile, the 81st Regiment attempted to recover the trapped men from two directions over the narrow streets. From one direction, flamethrower crews, bumblebees, and armored personnel carriers from the other, a special forces group supported by a tank. However, they were met with RPG and heavy machine gun fire, forcing them to retreat. The Chechens, however, fearing that they would be surrounded by more approaching Russian units, backed off and formed defensive positions on the outskirts of the village. In the early morning of December 21, the Chechens began to counterattack, unloading a barrage of bullets and charging into the scouts Senior Warrant Officer Viktor Ponomaryov. Realizing that they could not hold the bridge, Senior Warrant Officer alongside Sergeant Konstantin Abradaziev began to cover his men's retreat. Promenyev on his own killed 7 Chechens and knocked out a UAZ truck and a machine gun emplacement as small waves of Chechens attempted to overrun the retreating scouts. Sergeant Abradaziev, who was attempting to lay down suppressive fire, was wounded severely, knocking him out of the fight. Ponomaryov, having witnessed this, rushed to his aid, firing and dragging the wounded sergeant as mortar fire began to rain down around him. Ponomaryov would receive numerous wounds from the shrapnel fragments brought upon by the mortars, yet he continued to fire and pull the sergeant out of the firefight. As a final act of strength, valor, and brotherly love, he covered the sergeant with his body as a nearby mine exploded, the blast and shrapnel killing him instantly, only mere feet from the arrival of the 104th Guards Airborne Division paratroopers, who had barely arrived to cover the withdrawal and proceeded to participate in the firefight. The fight for the bridge raged on for the next 12 hours, of which the Chechens would eventually fall back due to the reinforcements of motorized troops, airborne, and artillery, which were beginning to make its presence known. In total, 21 men were killed, dozens wounded, and several vehicles destroyed alongside the shot-down helicopter, while Chechen casualties were still relatively unknown, yet estimated to be in the dozen as well. With the bridge held, more forces began to trickle in, making their way towards Grozny slowly but steadily. Around the time on December 18th, when the Russian High Command gave the fateful order of change to the rules of engagement, Aslan Maskhadov, the second-in-command of the Chechen forces under Dudayev, began to order and set up blocking units in the village of Alkan Kala. Located only 25 miles away from the village of Asnovolskaya and only 11 miles from Grozny, it was vital for the Chechens to hold off the Russians as long as they could in order to further bolster their defenses in the capital. The assignment of the defense of this village was assigned to the newly established Golonashyozoi Regiment, composed of 40 men, including their commander, a local who ran a business in Volgograd named Shadumsin Bokoyov. For the next 2 days, the Chechens prepared the defensive positions, composed of a concrete machine gun position that remained from the Second World War, a caponnier defense in the form of a BTR turret, and a D-30 122mm howitzer alongside a mortar and a network of trenches. In addition, a BM-21 Grad 122mm rocket launcher truck was also requested. On the night of December 20, 2 scout groups of Chechens began to report on an incoming Russian unit, which was the 8th Airborne Company and a 104th Airborne Regiment. These 2 groups, separated from the main body, were appealing targets of opportunity. and a plan was formed to ambush them the moment they neared the ridge toward the village of Alcancala. However, the plan itself was not coordinated with Maskhadov, resulting in an amateur initiative that would cost dearly. The BM-21 Grad, firing 122mm rockets, and the D-30, unloading 3 SH-2 flechette rounds, were imprecise, only managing to hit the rear of the leading convoy with no damage toward the vehicles or the men themselves. The Russian paratroopers, already experienced from their previous engagements, fired back, disabling the D-30 howitzer alongside killing the crew, resorting in the remaining Chechen forces located near the gun to fall back. At around 2 in the morning, as the cold and the fog rolled in even more, a group of Galanochesai Regiment Chechens managed to sneak into the perimeter of a Russian paratrooper camp, killing a sentry by the name of Senior Lieutenant Bulba with a knife. It was during their killing of Lieutenant Bulba when they were spotted by Junior Sergeant Vitaly Balban, a BM-3 gunner who yelled to alert his comrades and jumped into the gunner position, unloading with a salvo of 30mm cannon shot and 7.62mm PKM machine gun fire, killing several of the Chechens and unleashing chaos throughout the camp. As one Chechen survivor described it, everything was engulfed in flames. An RPG shot to the turret, however, knocked it out of commission alongside killing Balban. The Chechens, shocked and overall finding themselves in the midst of the 104th Regiment, were gunned down, of which out of the 38 men, only 11 managed to escape. Russian casualties were 1 officer alongside the lieutenant and a sergeant. As morning arrived on December 21st, Russian forces were further subjected to imprecise D-30 122mm howitzer fire 7 miles to the north of Alcancala from the village of Ovcharovsky. However, one lucky round hit a 2S9 Nona of the 237th Regiment, killing 2 Russian crew members. The same day, Chechen commanders arrived at Alcancala, including Ruslan Gilyav, a combat veteran of 14 years turned commander who would earn the nickname Black Angel in the months to come. Ruslan, seeing the nonsense of attacking the massive Russian force via small groups, recommended a retreat to Grozny, of which the Chechens proceeded to do with great effect. As the Russians moved deeper to reach the capital of Grozny, it should have been more obvious that the resistance of the Chechens was one of a force that would not merely submit nor surrender to Russian demands or rule, it would fight to the bitter end. December 22nd, 1994. Battle for Bekat Yort. On December 22nd, elements of the 104th Guards Air Assault of General Chenarov began to move from the south towards the towns of Argonne, which was only 11 miles from the eastern side of Grozny. Their mission was to destroy bridges along the Argonne River to prevent further Chechen reinforcements and make preparations to take the Kankala airfield, which would serve as a forward operating base and supply depot. However, this was easier said than done. As the sun began to set, an airborne company of the 328th Regiment began to make its way over the fields near the highway, taking positions to the east of Bekat Yort, a small village only 5 miles to the northwest of Argonne. The arrival of the paratroopers was unexpected for the Chechens, but they were soon reinforced with a group of 20 men, commanded by Uzman Imayev, a former head of the Chechen Central Bank turned military leader. More men arrived, alongside a group of Shamil Basayev's reconnaissance diversionary battalion. Umayev offered to ambush the leading convoy, but the RDB opposed such an idea, saying it'd be too risky as the Russians were moving over open fields. Umayev, however, refused to listen and pressed forward with the attack, positioning his men alongside the railway tracks, believing that the Russians could not move over to the bridge that was heavily mined. The convoy of the 238th Regiment was assembled in the space of a U, with tanks and Tugunska spas, which were armed with 2 times twin-barrel 30mm cannons, guarding the front and flanks, while the main body of paratroopers had BMD and BTRD vehicles providing further cover and fire support. The Chechens split into groups of 2, one being responsible for firing the RPG, while the other 2 carried 2 to 3 rounds. The idea was that they would be able to fire at least 2 shots, and impossible the third, and then retreat. When the first shots were fired at the rear section of the convoy at 12:15 in the morning on December 23rd, flares illuminated the landscape as a firefight began. Explosions, screams, and curses filled the air in Russian, yet the airborne were far from unguarded. The steady fire of the 30mm cannons from their Tugunska spas, and the blasting by smoothbore 73mm BMD guns and 125mm T-72 guns began to land along the railway tracks. This barrage of heavy firepower forced the Chechens to keep their heads down as they began to maneuver, reaching a distance of only 218 yards from the railway tracks. At that range, the Russian airborne then followed up alongside with a barrage of AK-47 fire mixed with light PKM machine gun fire. On the remaining edge of the effective range of RPG fire, the Chechens began to pull back, only to be gunned down or wounded, including Uzman Imayev, who received a shot to the chest and shrapnel to his back. Many of their vehicles, which had been parked near the bridge that they were holding, instantly became mere scraps of burning metal, making the evacuation of the wounded impossible, with some left behind, while those who could still move alongside the survivors fled on foot. The aftermath of this ambush, alongside the counterattack, left 8 Russian dead, 19 wounded, 2 destroyed BDM vehicles, alongside 3 tanks, and several other BDMs disabled. As the sun began to rise, General Rollin ordered his men to destroy the bridge over the Argun River that the Chechens were guarding. However, heavy fire from the side of the Argun did not allow the sappers to approach the bridge, so they came up with a different plan. The idea was to take a Ural truck, fill it full of explosives, and detonate it on the bridge. Although they succeeded in reaching the center of the bridge, it was not successfully detonated until the commander of the flamethrowing platoon, Lieutenant Ren Masmogov, fired an RPO-A Shmel, demolishing a section of the bridge into ragged chunks of metal and concrete, rendering it useless. Through the use of smoke grenades, the Russians successfully covered their retreat, completely securing the positions of the R-306 highway alongside the stretch toward Kankala. By December 25th, the battle groups had managed to reach their good positions, with the 125 Motorized Rifle Regiment, with the 103rd OTB to the west, the battalion of the 337th Airborne Regiment to the center-south, and the battalion of the 324th Airborne Regiment to the east. The same day, General Anatoly Kozmovin sent orders for the preliminary preparations for entering into the city and Chechen capital Grozny, and began to restructure the joint group from 3 to 4. They would be organized in the following order. Group North, led by General Konstantin Polovolsky, the 131st Brigade and 91st Regiment located on the Turk Ridge, north of the Sadavoy, as well as 3 miles to the north of Ankon Chort. The 276th Motor Rifle Regiment, located on the Turk Ridge in the area of 3 to 4 miles northeast of the Sadavoy. Overall total of men and personnel and other vehicles, 4,000 men, 80 tanks, 200 APCs, and 60 artillery pieces. Group Northeast, led by General Lev Rocklin, 2 battalions of the 255th Motor Rifle Regiment, 2 battalions of the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment, the 68th Separate Reconnaissance Battalion, the 106th Separate Engineer Sapper Battalion, the 173rd Special Forces Battalion, the 28th Separate Tank Battalion, as they were located in Tolstoy Yort and Podmorovskaya. In total, they had 2,500 men, 30 tanks, 150 APCs, and 30 artillery pieces. Group East, led by General Nikolai Statskov, 2 battalions of the 129th Motor Rifle Division, the 133rd Separate Tank Battalion 1, the Joint Regiment of the 76th Airborne Division, which was composed of 3 airborne battalions, 1 artillery battalion, and 1 reconnaissance battalion from the Argun, and 1 joint battalion of the 98th Airborne Division. In total, they would have 3,000 men, 40 tanks, 170 APCs, and 40 artillery pieces. And finally, Group West, led by General Valery Petruk. It was composed of the 693rd Motor Rifle Regiment, the 503rd Motor Rifle Regiment, the 108th Special Reconnaissance Battalion, the 141st Separate Tank Battalion, a joint battalion of the 21st Airborne Brigade, a joint battalion of the 56th Airborne Brigade, a joint regiment of the 76th Airborne Division, which was composed of 3 airborne, 1 artillery, and 1 reconnaissance battalion, a joint regiment of the 106th Airborne Division, roughly around the same, with 3 airborne, 1 artillery, 1 reconnaissance battalion. In total, 5,000 men, 40 tanks, 300 APCs, and 70 artillery pieces. As the convoys continue to make their way to the rendezvous objectives to restructure in the coming days, a skirmish would break out on December 25th to December 28th that would explode into the first and only armored engagement of the war, known as the Battle of Kankala. The 129th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment and the 133rd Guards Separate Tank Battalion, alongside 2 elements of the 45th Guards Motor Rifle Division, began to arrive at the designated group areas. Originating from the village of Kamenka and based in the district of Leningrad Oblast, the units were both familiar with each other and would in early December spend a week of joint training and coordination, solidifying their esprit de corps and confidence for whatever else came their way on their push toward Grozny. The 125th Regiment, commanded by Colonel Borisov, had 1,690 men and 70 BTR-70s split among 2 battalions, those being the 1st and the 2nd. The 133rd Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ogor Tokayov, was composed of 250 men, 120 tanks, of which 36 were T-80s, 3 T-80Bs, and a T-80K, organized into 3 companies, which were the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. All tanks were equipped with ERA, explosive reactive armor blocks. On December 24, orders were issued for the units to move from the village of Mozdok to Konkala and take it over. The assault detachment included the following: the 1st Motor Rifle Battalion with BTRs led by Colonel Yuri Sharyok, and the 1st Tank Company of T-80BVs led by Captain Sergei Kachavsky. December 25th arrived, and the units marched toward Konkala and took both the settlement and the airfield without opposition, as it looked as if the Chechens had abandoned it completely. As the afternoon arrived, only 3 hours prior to its capture, did the Russians receive further orders to begin moving a mile to the south to block the Grozny-Argun road, leaving nobody to guard Konkala as they took defensive positions roughly a mile from Konkala. As night engulfed the Russians and moved into the following day of December 26, a sabotage and reconnaissance group of Chechens sneaked cautiously, maneuvering close to the position point of the 1st Motorized Battalion of the 129th Motor Rifle Regiment. When they were well within range, a barrage of AKs, PKMs, and RPGs slammed into the positions, resulting in the destruction of a BTR, the killing of its commander, alongside 5 other Russian soldiers, and several wounded in the process. The Russians opened fire wildly, panic and absolute fear beginning to take hold as they tried to get the bearings of where the gunfire was coming from. In the process of this wild firing, some Chechens were killed, and they fell back into the darkness just as quickly as they had attacked. After the Russians had left Konkala, and as the night attack was unfolding, a Chechen separate special forces battalion known as Boers, staffed by volunteers and combat veterans of the war in Abazakia, began to occupy it. Their commander, Umad Dashayev, was not only experienced, but had lost an eye as a result of a combat wound. Numbering 100 men, supported by 6 tanks and several BTRs and a BM-21, they began to solidify their defensive positions. They were also further equipped with several ATGMs alongside mortars, intending to make the Russians pay dearly for retaking Konkala. As the afternoon arrived on December 26, the 2nd Battalion of the 129th Regiment, alongside its remaining tanks of the 133rd Tank Battalion, began to make its way toward Konkala, having no idea what was waiting for them. On December 26th, then both sides began to finalize their preparations for the encounter that would follow, alongside firing artillery, making the presence known to each other as they engaged in a mortar duel that resulted in the death of a Russian soldier and several wounded from the 129th Regiment in the forest plantation near the airfield. The next day, on the morning of December 28th, the Russians began their assault at 11 a.m. into Konkala, with the 129th 9th and the 133rd attacking to the north from the highway, while the 1st Motorized Rifle Battalion attacked from the left. Meanwhile, the 2nd Motorized Rifle Battalion launched their attack alongside their tank company to the right, directly away from the direction of the airfield. However, it was as they moved closer that the 2nd Motorized Rifle Battalion would take its first loss, a T-80BV tank. T-80BV number 521 was traveling alongside a steep slope when all of a sudden it performed a sharp turn, trying to avoid incoming anti-tank fire, plunging into the ground at a height of roughly 49 feet. Although nobody was killed from the fall, the Chechens, noticing it disabled, began to open fire. In the process of this evacuation from the tank, the gunner, Yuri Sotoryanko, was killed, while his 2 other crew members, though wounded, managed to get away. Meanwhile, back to the north, an advancing MTOB command vehicle, the 129th Regiment, was knocked out by a shell of a Chechen T-72, killing its commander and driver, while another T-80BV was also hit, being abandoned due to severe damage and later destroyed by friendly fire to avoid its capture. In the midst of this inferno and chaos, First Tank Company Commander Captain Kalavsky managed to score a direct hit and kill on a Chechen T-72A, which had hit the MTOB. As he continued to fire with the coaxial machine gun and the main 125mm smoothbore gun, he was hit 3 times by RPGs, with the explosive reactive armor blocks being the only thing keeping them both alive and in the fight. And even after these hits, he scored another kill on the Chechen T-72A, while the rest of his tanks began to provide good cover for infantry who were supporting them. On the other side, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions began their flanking attack into the airfield with no Chechen tanks in their direction, but instead, crews of ATGM and RPG teams of the Chechen Separate Special Forces Battalion Boers who were positioned and dug in alongside the airfield and the aviation compound. T-80BV number 536 of the 2nd Company, commanded by Sergeant Yevgeny Gobernov, took a direct hit from an ATGM missile entering between the rollers and causing the ammunition to explode, killing him instantly alongside his crew as the tank turret was completely torn and thrown back several feet. However, it turned out that those men did not die, and that there were survivors, as the 2 crew members escaped a few seconds before the hit, receiving burns in the process as a result of the explosion. Another T-80BV, operated by Company Commander Lieutenant Zavakin, received a direct RPG hit but remained in working order. With support by the infantry of the 2nd Battalion, the RPG fire was suppressed, ensuring the rescue of the wounded tank crew and the capture of the Chechen airfield, but with the incoming fire continued from the aviation compound. In the midst of that firefight, Umar Dusayev was killed as he was leading his fellow Chechens, resulting in a massive hit to their morale, and overall deciding to abandon the airfield as a whole and head toward Konkala itself to reinforce their engaged comrades. As fighting raged throughout the night and into the next day, elements of the 98th Airborne Division approached Konkala and outflanked the Chechen positions located in the military compound from the right. As a result, during the night, the Chechens retreated back to Grozny, leaving behind all their armor and vehicles. By December 30th, Konkala was secured. The overall aftermath of the battle for Konkala was largely a victory for the Russians, having knocked out or destroyed 5 T-72A tanks and 1 T-62, along with the killing and wounding of several Chechen combatants of the Boers unit. The losses for the Russians, however, were 2 T-80BV tanks completely destroyed, the 1 T-80BV which fell down the slope in the quarry. It was eventually recovered, and another T-80 which had gotten its gun stuck in the ground and fired out of panic, cutting off its barrel. The fate of this tank, although not destroyed, was never repaired and instead converted into a recovery vehicle. Then, there were the 2 BTRs and the 1 MTLBU, which were completely destroyed, and with the body count for the Russians being several Russian dead and wounded, making the fight for Konkala one of the major and only armored engagements in the First Chechen War. The ambush and battle for Ovcharovsky. Around the same time that the assault for Konkala was raging on the 28th, the battalion of the 234th Airborne Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Oreskornel, with support from the 165th Separate Reconnaissance Company being led by Senior Lieutenant Andrei Shalev, with the objective of taking the 3 hills between the villages of Konkala and Oktyabrskaya in order to prevent any Chechen reinforcements from reaching Grozny, and as well from gaining control over the high ground for observation and defense. No intelligence was provided to the paratroopers, alongside having 2 of their companies of the battalion being rounded to different tasks, leaving only a reduced company of 52 men with a BMD, a BTRDZ, and 2 GAZ-66 trucks with only a single T-72A from the 141st Separate Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Nikolai Rotorovsky. As the convoy began to make its way along the route toward the village of Rotorovsky, they came upon a familiar sight as many other units did at the beginning of the war, as noted by one paratrooper. In one place, the column's path was blocked by local residents. The paratroopers remembered the order, "Do not shoot at civilians." The cars turned into another longer road. As the vehicles began to climb the hill, the BMD that was leading hit a mine, while at the very instant, a camouflage and well-placed Chechen T-30 122mm howitzer opened fire, directly hitting the gas truck carrying paratroopers, killing 19 instantly, leaving scattered pieces of twisted burning metal and gore scattered everywhere. The second gas truck was hit as well, only for the round to travel between the cabin and the trunk, exploding at a safe distance. The Chechens, taking initiative, then opened fire from a distance with small arms, mortars, another howitzer, and rounds of 122mm from 272 tanks, supported further by the 30mm cannon of a BMP-2 and the heavy machine guns of a BTR-70. The amount of heavy fire caused chaos among the paratroopers, rounds splintering trees, kicking up dirt, and leaving craters all along the road, as they kept low trying to find a way out of this ambush that made it clear that they were all going to die, as roughly half of their forces were already wiped out and wounded. Major Vladimir Kobodiansky, an experienced Afghan war veteran, screamed into the radio for artillery and air support, only to receive no response. In his fury, he gathered and regrouped his men under this barrage of lead for a counterattack, of which the BTRDZ, with its twin 23mm autocannons, began to fire back alongside the T-72A. On the other side of the route, members of the 165th, who managed to fall back from the heavy firing, began to deploy their ATGMs, covering their comrades and knocking out a howitzer alongside killing the Chechen tank crews who were trying to scramble to their vehicles. Lieutenant Nikolai Rotorovsky then arrived alongside the 165th, only to move backwards due to his newly conscripted gunner not knowing how to fire his weapon, resulting in their places being switched and getting back into the fight. Firing at a moving Chechen vehicle and destroying it, the lieutenant then sent a high-explosive round into a crowd of Chechens that were attempting to fall back, resulting in a blasted gore and pieces of human beings being scattered and smearing the ground and surrounding area. It was after that shot that an ATGM hit the T-72, causing it to explode. Even as it burned, Lieutenant Nikolai jumped out, firing wildly before being cut down alongside his scorched armor. In the midst of this, the paratroopers overran the defensive Chechen positions, turning a captured D-30 and a BMP with a UTOS NSF heavy machine gun against the retreating Chechens. Yet in the distance, a reinforcement convoy of 120 Chechens, 2 tanks, 4 CAM AZ trucks, and 2 infantry fighting vehicles were heading towards them to wipe them out and take the positions that they had lost. With only 30 men, alongside their original vehicles that remained and those they captured, Senior Lieutenant Shalev of the 165th set up his men in superior defensive positions and formed a firing line to recover them completely from any assault or flanking attack. With this, alongside the vehicles, mortars, howitzer, and ATGMs they remained, they would repulse the first assault wave. For the next 6 hours, 4 times in total would the Chechens attempt to take the position and attempt to wipe out the paratroopers to no avail. Throughout the night of the 28th and into the following day and night of the 29th, both sides, weary and exhausted, merely resorted to a small random skirmishes of firing pot shots at each other from a distance. On the 30th of December, elements of the 76th Airborne would secure the village of Ovodorovsky, forcing the remainder of the Chechens to fall back to Grozny, and for the 234th to be relieved, as Kankala was also secured around the same time. With that, both the east and west of Grozny would be secured by the Russians, beginning the preparations for their assault into the city. Little did the Russians know, as they camped on the outskirts of Grozny in preparation, that their assault on New Year's Eve would have them charge directly into what could only be described as a purgatory of hell, steel, blood, and concrete. The First Battle of Grozny was about to begin. So, a while back when I actually started researching this and honestly trying to develop the podcast as a whole, it wasn't easy by any means, just organizing everything, the units and everything, not to mention the information being very limited. So, as a result, it did take me a couple months to get this all, into formation. The plan is for episode 3 to come out to around, honestly, mid to late May. Just gonna be honest, expected by early June, depending on my working schedule, but other than that, I am genuinely happy that I could finally release this, honestly, episode as a whole, this part 2. I know I kept a lot of you waiting, and I do apologize for that, but overall, I do look forward to continuing this series. Expect a lot more, visceral, a lot more action, a lot more gore, and just know that, again, war is hell. So, other than that, until next time, look forward to part 3. Have a good one.